As an archetype, I kind of hate drone casters. Well, I don't hate them, the drone gimmick is cool and all, but I don't like how they feel in relation to core casters. Drone caster damage scales up with every attack on the same target, and it resets when they change targets. So they're supposed to be better against one big target, while several small ones are handled by core casters instead. In practice, the drone only needs 5 attacks to get their full damage bonus, attack faster than core casters, and have more DPS before fully stacking their trait anyway. So they're just an outright stronger archetype. To the point that when they were thinking of how to make this new core caster power creep everyone, the best idea AG had was to just make him a drone caster. It's sad when new archetypes make an old one redundant, though granted it's not quite as bad as AoE guards and reapers. Sometimes though AG gets it just right and makes a new archetype that has a clear defined role without power creeping what came before. Yeah, we're talking about Mystic casters today, mostly because they're one of my favorite archetypes in Arknights. Is it just because Indigo is a Mystic caster? Yes, absolutely. But hey, they're cool and I want to talk about it. So I built the other Mystic casters, took them for a spin, and some of them are almost as cool as Indigo. So what's so fun about them? When they have no enemies in range, they store attacks for later. They also generate a charge when they fire, so at full stacks they hit a target 4 or more times instantly. This is basically the arts class for deleting one enemy in particular. No, not that. Texas S2 is for deleting 2/3 of the enemies in particular. For their stats they have stupidly high attack with low attack speed to maximize the charge damage, but still make them weaker than core casters when they don't have any charges. This is a good place for an archetype. It has its own clear role, to nuke one single target every few dozen seconds, while not overtaking the generic DPS role like what drone casters do. Something I appreciate is that all 5 Mystic casters have cohesive kits. They have a talent that benefits their damage somehow, combined with skills that work well in combination with their talents. And Ebon houses too. Nothing wrong with meme skills, I suppose. Having synergistic kits sounds like something basic, but if you think about it, there are a lot of operators that don't even manage that. Or they just have boring statics talents that you never think about. Meanwhile, with Mystic casters we have Indigo's chance to bind on hit, which defines her whole kit as an operator, Iris and Ebon Hose having bonus damage on stored attacks, so you want to make sure they properly store them, Harmony having extra damage against blocked enemies and slowing enemy movement speed. Okay, yeah, this one is sort of weird, but there is a logic to it, we'll come back later, and Delphine only being able to attack high health targets and doing bonus damage to high health targets, while bleeding them afterwards. For the most part, they all have different conditions for their optimal damage beyond just stack 5 charges, so they all feel surprisingly different even though they're part of the same archetype. On the other hand, every Mystic caster shares the same first skill: reduce attack by 50%, give them Ifrit-like range, reduce their attack interval by 5 or 6 times, resulting in about 2.5 to 3 times their base DPS. Decent damage, but this is usually worthless as a DPS skill. A range aside, the skill only lasts 5 seconds with a 15-second cooldown. You can find some map where the extra range is beneficial and you gain value using it as a DPS skill, but its intended use is to build charges. The reduced range is so the Mystic caster can hit enemies and then quickly build up to max charges, allowing your Mystic caster to do a couple full power shots in very quick succession. Now, before I explain why this skill is complete trash and probably hurt the perception of Mystic casters as a whole, I'll point out that it's not as terrible on Iris and Ebon Hose. They have talents that buff their stored charges, so they gain DPS from storing charges, even if they have a target in range constantly. Saying that physically hurt me. There are several issues with this skill, namely opportunity cost, and opportunity cost. In effect, the skill only gives you one full charge attack. Every other Mystic caster skill is a stronger DPS buff than that. You're giving up a much more powerful skill to run this, particularly with Ebon Hoses 3, which is literally a better version of the generic Mystic skill one. So Mystics are better than other casters when they have time to build their charges in order to output more total damage despite their lower DPS. If you have a map with isolated enemies, so you can be sure Mystics won't waste any DPS, and you have a time to build charges between elites, then you don't need skill 1. If you can't store your charges fast enough between waves, then Mystics lose their value compared to drone and core casters. Most of the time when the skill 1 is useful, you're just better off using a different archetype, because their skill 1 tries to cover the weakness of high recovery time instead of playing to their strength of high burst. Imagine this: you have a Mystic caster with full charges, they smack an elite, do a bunch of damage, and then you use Q1, build another full charge, and hit it again. Now if you've killed it and have enough time to recharge before the next elite, great, Mystic is one use case. But what if you didn't kill the elite and have to keep wasting the charges to finish it off? Or there is a new elite coming before you can recharge? Then you have a low DPS caster with no skill, when you could have had a much higher DPS caster with an attack multiplier skill. On top of that, that same Mystic caster probably does have an attack multiplier in their other skills. Keep in mind that quickly killing an enemy with a strong DPS skill can also let your Mystic build charges. So while the use case of skill 1 is very clear, in practice it's extremely difficult to find a map where they're a worthwhile option when compared to using a higher damage skill on a different caster entirely. Not to say such opportunities don't exist in the game, but they are certainly the exception instead of the rule. We've gone over their basic, their usage, similarities, why their skill 1 sucks, but to explain why this is such a fun archetype, and why I built all of them, we need to get into the specifics. A lot of operators within an archetype feel very replaceable. Anti-air snipers shoot fast, with low physical damage. Yes, Mei is very awesome, I know. But the vast majority do the same thing, just better or worse to some degree. Same for the standard defenders that just block, or the outdated vanguard archetypes that nobody uses anymore. Meanwhile, there are 5 Mystic casters, and they all have wildly different skills and talents that make them perform optimally in different roles. Indigo can keep 1 or 2 targets in place for much longer than most other operators, Iris uses a sleep debuff to store charges and does AoE for some random reason, Harmony has an AoE slow that does Earth Spirit levels of damage, and Eben is too pretentious to attack trash mobs. Delphine has a hat. Hats aside, they're so different from each other that it's worth breaking down what each of them do in particular, rather than just talking about the archetype in general. Iris was the first Mystic caster, and as such her entire kit revolves around her trait. The talent gives bonus damage to stored attacks, and her abilities let her store attacks. Iris Q2 doesn't have a duration, so it can often be ready for every elite. The way it works is that you let Iris smack the enemy, put them to sleep for 7 seconds to build some charges, and then smack them with the bonus damage for stored charges. Also her S2 does AoE damage for some reason. Sometimes it can randomly be useful to kill a slug wave, but most often it's just a bit of bonus damage on the sleeper. For a Mystic caster, I'd argue Iris has an extremely straightforward design. Smack, skill, smack. Kinda like how you use skill 1, but with more damage thanks to the explosion. Her main weaknesses are that she lacks a way to avoid wasting shots on trash during her skill 2 sleep, and the lack of a self buff means she's only effective against a certain HP threshold. On top of that, while the sleep buys you 7 seconds, most operators can't target the enemy in the meantime, which lowers the potential total damage when using her along with other operators. Her total damage when maxed and in ideal circumstances would be about 20,000 damage, with an extra 5,000 damage or so if she puts a second enemy to sleep with her skill. Great if that finishes off the elite, but otherwise she is left with her low DPS and no way to store charges for another 30 seconds. We can see the weakness of the Mystic S1 in her skill 2. Regardless, she's a solid enough operator for a new archetype, clear identity, and a good kit synergy between talent and skill. Next up we have Indigo, who to everyone's surprise is my favorite operator in the bunch, but also I'd argue the second best one after Ebenhaus. The reason I rank her so highly is her talent. Every attack she does has a chance to bind the target in place for several seconds. The stored charges count as their own separate attacks, so they add to her crowd control. But unlike Iris, she doesn't need to store charges to get her full damage. Firing off cooldown and storing the attack leads to the same amount of damage. Her biggest downside also comes from her talent, as she can't attack targets that are already bound. No war crimes for her, I guess. It doesn't matter if it's her binds or anyone else's, she won't attack. This is a huge downside, as it means she can't permabind like Ethan. To be clear, I don't mind operators having weaknesses built into their kit. Especially for Indigo, her inability to attack bound targets works well with her skill 2. It multiplies the talent bind chance by 3, reduces her attack interval. On top of that, it damages any bound enemies in range for 20% of Indigo's attack every half seconds. Oh, torture. I guess she does do war crimes, disregard my previous comment. 20% attack doesn't sound like much, but 2 hits per second means it does as much damage as Indigo's attack every 2.5 seconds. On top of her own attacks, for a max Indigo the total damage on one target is around 26,000. when accounting for her dot. Technically the same as Iris, but Iris will get ahead with a few extra attacks she does after her skill. And she has a 30-second skill cycle to Indigo's 60-second one. You might be wondering if you can get a ton of damage from Indigo by combining her with another source of bind like Ethan. If the bind is never interrupted, the dot will do 10,000 damage over her skill duration. This can be decent, but only if you can get the damage from Indigo's own attacks as well. Since Ethan binds so often, he can prevent Indigo from attacking at all during her skill. 10,000 damage on its own isn't too impressive. At that point you would be better off using a more standard AoE operator. While Indigo's damage is surprisingly high for a 4-star, it's the bind that makes her so powerful. When she uses her skill, she can keep an enemy in range for 20 seconds with incredible consistency. Bind, store 2 attacks, bind again. Unlike Iris before her, she doesn't put enemies to sleep, so all your other operators are free to DPS while the enemy is stuck in place. The skill has a relatively high SP cost, by 4-star standards anyway, at 40 seconds, so it isn't always ready for every wave, but since Indigo can still bind enemies off skill, she can stall them enough to buy that extra time. I talked down the Indigo-Ethan combination earlier, but it makes her surprisingly flexible for a Mystic caster. She can both nuke isolated enemies while dishing out more damage against the group than a core or drone caster of lower rarity would. Speaking of drone casters, I started the video by talking about how drone casters are a bit overpowered. This is especially pronounced with 4-stars. In general, talents that have some unique effect, like Indigo's, are much more powerful than stat buff talents. Haze has a unique talent that lowers enemy res and has a fairly powerful attack buff. And she still gets blasted out of the water by Click, who only has a basic extra attack speed talent. After the modules dropped, I'd argue Indigo is on the same level as Click. She can't match Click in DPS, but she isn't that far off during her skill, and more than compensates the disparity with her own crowd control. Alright, that's enough about Indigo. Time for the Smug Cat. Her skill 2 makes a big AoE that slows enemies by 60% and does 250 DPS. Weirdly small damage, but okay. With her own attack she goes over 1000 DPS, so comparable to Click or Haze's 2 if you don't care about the AoE. You might notice I talked about skill damage or burst with other mystics, but switched to DPS for Harmony. There's a reason for that. She competes for roles that drone and core casters usually prefer. Her skill 2 might seem extremely awkward at first, slowing enemies in range, but being unable to attack unblocked enemies. Don't worry, you are not confused, it's also awkward when you use it properly. It makes some sense because her talent increases damage done to blocked enemies, so it helps her select relevant targets for her talent. You can even gravel enemies once she has full charges to help her target selection. This further establishes that she isn't a typical Mystic caster, since you usually use them to kill isolated elites by themselves. Instead of that, she is meant to work in a busy lane. 60% slow is quite a bit, and some other operators can kill all the trash before they are blocked, while Harmony kills the one elite that you did block. In that kind of position her own damage is decent, while the slow and negative DPS her skill 2 adds helps deal with the trash. Not that complicated to use now, is it? It's also worth mentioning that her skill 2 is one of the few actual AoE skills in Arknights, meaning it actually works on invisible enemies. My biggest complaint is that she feels like she should be a different archetype instead. You tend to use all of her charges before using her skill 2, so you often miss on the talent damage, and then she just attacks off cooldown instead of storing the attacks. Feels a lot more like a core caster in actual gameplay. In short, a functional niche operator, but she doesn't feel like a Mystic caster to me. Delphine, the hat wearer, is questionable. To start with, because the goat gets off on a technicality, she is the only Mystic caster in the game that has no crowd control of any kind, so she is a pure DPS operator. She has a 100% attack buff, a talent that increases her damage to enemies above 80% health, a long-lasting dot, and an inability to attack enemies at low health. So she is supposed to smack an enemy once, stack up her bleed, and then let them die from that while she builds charges for the next targets. It sounds like a normal functional kit when I describe it like this, but in practice it's very weird. Her S2 is a 40 SP cost skill with a 30-second duration. The bleed she applies during the skill lasts until the end of her skill, so the most damage she gets is from the full charge hit right at the start of her skill. Then that enemy is taking an additional 21,000 damage from the bleed over the skill duration. She needs 4 hits to stack up her bleed, so even if she can stack her charges immediately after the first attack, she'll take over 10 seconds before she could apply her full bleed on a different target. By that point the bleed would only do 14,000 damage. Her own attack is fairly high, and with all her buffs active, a hit from her does 3600 damage. So when a hits once every 3 seconds, that's 1200 DPS, plus 175 DPS per bleed stack. I know, I'm supposed to complain about how there's many other casters who do more damage and all that, but damage is fine. 1400 DPS and skill is decent. Remember, Harmony is in a decent operator herself with a bit less DPS. However, the way the skill works makes no sense for a Mystic caster. You get one huge hit, then the charges become a mostly irrelevant mechanic unless she runs out of targets. But even then, the longer she waits before applying her next bleed, the less damage the bleed does. Despite her relatively high on paper damage, in practice the skill falls apart. It would have worked much better if it was a short SP cost skill like Iris has, that empowered her next attack and stored charges with similar properties. Regardless, we can see the idea. She is a 5-star Ebenhaus, pure damage focused mystic but without the short SP cost of Eben S3 or the ability to cancel it, instead having a cutesish bleed proc. Speaking of Eben, we finally get to the 6-star mystic. Usually they give 6 stars more complicated kits than lower rarities, but Eben feels like the opposite to me. He almost entirely disregards the crowd control angle, except for his kind of meme goat summoning skill, in favor of damage and uptime. I mentioned that his skill tree is a straight up better version of the generic Mystic caster's one. It prevents him from wasting shots on trash by making him only target elites, increases his ASPD so he charges faster, increases his attack and the scaling on his stored charges for some sweet multiplicative scaling bonuses. The skill has a 30-second duration, but can be turned off at any point, and only has an SP cost of 20, meaning it's an extremely flexible skill that is basically always available, no matter the enemy's timing. Finally, because most of his damage amps come from talents, instead of his attack he gains a huge benefit from buffs. Though I'm sure most of you already know this, he is one of the go-to kill the boss in 1 second operators. Sounds good on paper, and really he is, but he wasn't received too well on release. How so? Is it because you all have no taste? Obviously yes, but also, as I've often discussed before, the goal of Arknights is to kill all the enemies with your operators. DPS is paramount, and while Ebenhaus has top tier burst, being able to casually throw out tens of thousands of damage like it's nothing, for a 6-star that's a bit underwhelming. Eben S3 feels like a 6-star skill too. Removes their weaknesses, lets them do super high damage, but they still play like the archetype is supposed to. If he was released today, it probably would be his skill 2, and skill 3 would be something like Ebenhaus stops generating charges and begins channeling for 10 seconds. Upon completion, he summons your anus on the tile in front of Ebenhaus. Your fat ass then finds the highest health enemy on the field and crashes into it for XYZ true elemental blueberry damage, and repeats this equal to the number of stored charges Ebenhaus has. Talent 1 and Talent 2 bonuses are multiplied by your weight and applied to all enemies done by your anus. Basically double US3, but it only hits 3 times. Gotta keep things balanced after all. Okay, back to reality. Ebenhaus is what I describe as a good chasis, meaning that he is an excellent target to stack buffs on during S3, the in-game one, not your anus. And with the Necrosis model he does close to 30k damage with one fully charged attack. That's a big ass number and all, but the real thing is that his only common buff is a 65% attack increase, so he gets great value from buffs and debuffs you can pile on. It's relatively easy to get him to a point where he can one-shot most bosses in the game, especially the old ones around his release. Great comfort op for when you really don't want to read the boss mechanics. I think considering how hard they tend to go at some 6 stars, if they didn't want to give him a generic red button Q everything, for his S3 they should have considered giving him some form of crowd control instead. I know, they did that with his meme S2 goat skill, but his skill 2 has a number of issues that make it unreliable. Worst of all, the goats pop instantly, so if you want to use them for AoE, a bunch of enemies rush in, the first enemy will eat all the goats because they detonate so quickly. As a bonus, the goats can expertly aim random enemies right into the blue box, as one would expect of a meme skill. So that concludes my entirely too long analysis of Mystic casters. Despite being the same archetype and all being focused on taking down elites, they have very different tools to do this. Iris does one big charge shot swap, some meme AoE damage, and can set up Blem and Ratu for war crimes. Indigo keeps key target in place and can off-roll as an AoE caster. The Smug Cat can isolate elites mixed within a crowd of enemies with some support. Delphine has a hat, and Eben is a pretentious twat that only interacts with important enemies. I feel like I just made a 4000 word essay on why Indigo is the best Mystic caster in the game. Well, I didn't not try to do that. Point is, Mystic casters are one of the better designed archetypes in Arknights, and while not perfect, have some of the more interesting kits in the game. If you're looking for some interesting operators to build, they're definitely worth a thought.